cost of giving way to reckless urges will surely generate to irrational acts of violence and harms. However, it seems to me that overlooking the nature and evolution of emotion and passion in international relations, we would be unable to comprehend the phenomena of change in international affairs. In recent years, a number of scholars have been increasingly interested in taking emotion and passion seriously as an academic area of research. Jonathan Masher and Netta Crawford were among the first to do so. Jonathan Masher argued that emotion is necessary to rationality and intrinsic to choice, and stressed that understanding how rational actors think requires turning to emotions. Furthermore, Netta Crawford also criticized traditional models of international political behavior and suggests that scholars should adopt the reductionist view of how particular emotion function in world politics. Masher's and Crawford's work have substantially influenced attempts to theorize emotion in world politics. It has even become common to speak of an emotional term. Intrinsically, in this emotional term, we can find that neuroscience is playing an important role. It provides concrete evidence for the idea that decisions and judgments are fundamentally imbued with emotion. Therefore, emotion are an intrinsic part of how politics is conducted, perceived, and evaluated. We can also confirm this point from the recent development in democratic theory. For instance, in the book called Civil Passion, Professor Sharon Krause from Brown University has criticized the Habermasian approach to deliberative democracy and argued that instead of the rationality, we should pay more attention on the sentiment and passion, drawing on the resources ranging from the David Hume's theory of moral sentiment to recent findings in neuroscience. Sharon Krause provides a systematic account of how passion can generate an impartial standpoint and contribute in valuable way to public deliberation. In this wonderful speech, Professor Coicaud clarified the centrality of emotion for analyzing and understanding the nature and evolution of political regime, and the importance of emotion in democracy. I agree with his argument. I think it's quite creative and very, very thought-provoking. Following that, I would like to address some questions regarding the nature of geopolitics, democracy, and emotion to Professor Coicaud, especially the fourth part of your presentation. The first question is more philosophical. How do you account for the difference between emotion and passion in your scheme? Second, in your view, the current international projection of democracy gives primacy to power and negative emotion and passion. If that is the case, you point out the importance of a core responsibility at the world level and propose 3 ways of reforms. However, it seems to me they are quite ambiguous for me. For instance, international institutions such as the WTO, IMF, even the UN are themselves far from democratic. How to deal with all kinds of democratic deficit in those international organizations. Moreover, how to evaluate the promotion, protection, and enforcement of international human rights regime, and the doctrine of the universal jurisdiction. Third, in terms of the Asia in the international system and its evolution, Professor anticipates that because of four types of obstacles, it is quite unlikely that China will succeed in generating global intellectual and emotional identification, and therefore will be able to transform substantially the international system on its terms. To be frank, I'm not sure I agree with your argument. Why do you think the domestic credibility of the Chinese regime is shaky? According to a recent Asian Barometer survey data from the mainland China, the degree of legitimacy of the Chinese political system is very high. There is little doubt that the larger majority of Chinese people consider the current political system to be the appropriate system for their country. I think maybe Professor Chen can join this discussion. Last but not least, as some scholar has already proved that the China model as an alternative modernization model has largely enhanced the normative power of the autocracy over democracy in international political system. As China has replaced the USA as either the largest foreign investor or the largest export market for a series of countries, especially in developing regions such as Africa and Southeast Asia. It has played a growing significant role in the international division of authoritarianism through promoting China's modernization model worldwide. So why do you think that a political regime shaped by authoritarian value and emotion will be now well placed to generate a type of soft power able to contribute to a stable international identification? I'm wondering if you'd like to elaborate on this point. In closing, I would conclude by thanking Professor Coicaud for sharing his insightful views with us. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, I can quickly answer. So the first question has to do with emotions and passions, and in publications, I think that you have one of them in front of you. I explained the difference between emotions and passions. Passions are made of emotions, so that's the overlap dimension between emotions and passions. What distinguishes passion from emotions is that passions have a willful and oriented character that emotions do not necessarily have. Willful emotions can also have this willful and target-oriented character. So that would be my short answer to this relationship between emotions and passions. The issue of co-responsibility. You're absolutely right when it comes to WTO, the UN, the IMF. None of these organizations are very democratic. In fact, at best, the way for us to qualify the relationship of international organizations to democratic ideals, ideas and values is one of ambiguity at best. So you're absolutely right. You talk about also the protection of international human rights. In fact, I also totally agree with you. I tend to argue that when it comes to human rights at the international level, international law is not international law, or it is not law, because it doesn't truly create a legal obligation. At best, international law in the field of human rights creates a sense of moral obligation. But a moral obligation doesn't trigger automaticity and consistency of action. Hence the fact that in my view international law as applied to human rights doesn't really exist in terms of law, if we understand that law is about automaticity of reaction and so on. The fourth question has to do with China and authoritarianism. In fact, it happens that I started my career writing on authoritarian democracies in Latin America. In fact, my first doctorate and book was on authoritarian democracies in authoritarian regimes in general, and more specifically in America. And I tend to think that what we at times describe as strong regimes, authoritarian regimes, are in fact weak regimes. For me, by definition, an authoritarian regime is weak because it doesn't really it makes any form of dissent. It gives to any form of dissent a strategic importance, hence its weakness. So if there is an authoritarian dimension to the China regime, by definition, in my view, it makes it open to strategic weaknesses. So that would be one way to answer this, and then you have all the domestic challenges that China is encountering in these days. And then how do you go about projecting in the international realm an authoritarian creed and make it the source of legitimate political order?
Well, there are already some very controversial issues involved. Now we invite people from the audience to raise comments or questions. We have about 40 minutes left, so I suggest that we will continue for 30 minutes in raising questions or comments. And then we'll leave about 10 minutes or perhaps 15 minutes to Professor Coicaud to respond. Okay. Now, please.
Don't be shy.
There must be a first. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I may start with a loose comment, which is partially a question. I'm sorry I haven't prepared very precisely my comment. It's about populism. It seems to me, Jean-Marc, that you have described populism probably rightly as a new phenomenon, or at least something which is of growing importance, and I don't think that anybody would challenge that. We see it everywhere. However, I'm wondering whether democracy by itself, and I hope I'm not going to say something horrible here, too shocking. I'm wondering whether democracy has not always based on populism. You have rightly remembered that Aristotle described democracy as the perversion of the republic in his model, and the answer is there. Democracy, the way it functions, necessarily calls for a form of reduction of issues so that we can explain them and so that we can be elected on values, projects, etc. So, in a way, I think that links between populism and democracy are intrinsic. So then, and we have a sort of proof of that, since that in democracy's history, as soon as we have elections based on universal suffrage, we see each camp accusing each other of being populist. And if two camps are at the same time accusing each other as being populist, it means in a way that populism is very difficult to avoid in democracies. So I would question the idea that populism looks more important today, and I would wonder whether it looks like more important, whereas actually it's probably structural. Is it because the democracies, and in general each political regime, is facing an incredible complexification of issues to be addressed today? Is it because there is a menace, an objective menace of general destructuration of societies, polities, and international society today? Is it because regimes are facing increasing and incredibly massive fluxes of humans across borders, which are reshaping territories, values, as we see in Europe, but it's the acme of the problem, as we see in Europe with the crisis now. So, isn't it that kind of issue that let us realize that populism is so important in democracies and so menacing for democracies? many more things to do. But in order to say, but in order not to speak too much, I would finish on one point is saying that in the world, when we oppose democracies and other forms of regimes like authoritarianisms, which are so resilient now compared to what we used to say in the 1990s, praising the third wave of democracy, etc. In this world that opposes the two kind of families of regimes, studying things through the angle of passions and emotions as you do, and thinking about populism make us realize that perhaps differences, even though they are huge, cannot hide the fact that there are many common points between democracies and authoritarianisms, if I may say something that shocking. In the sense that both types of regimes are basically organizing passions, and it's very close to what you just said. Constitutions, types of regimes are a matter of organizing social relations for the best of everybody, the common good, but also organizing on a permanent basis, on a daily basis, passions. So passions are the heart of regimes, of the fact of being together, and probably something has changed that let us see more clearly this right now. And as Professor Chen said in opening the speech, Professor Sechin Yeong-Shyang, who said very rightly what so many of us think, we have studied so long international society and regimes, but we did not see clearly until recently that passions and values are at the core of it.
More questions, please?
Thanks for Jean-Marc, Professor Coicaud. Okay, I appreciate very much your project of trying to connect political regime with emotions. And in your terms, the regime of patience and emotions and regime and the traditional regime, they can be connected in a way for us to understand more about the regime and the patience. I think this structure, this idea is very helpful. It's a good starting point for us to study patience and emotions. Because patience and emotions are too difficult, too hard to study. And your way to try to connect it with regime, I think is very helpful. I also think there's weakness in this project. And so the merit and the weakness, I think they are together, right? Okay. The merit, I think, actually somehow help us to understand why the democratic project will never be fully finished, right? Because if democracy is based on universality and equality, then people will be always very dissatisfied with any democratic projects, including the refugee and the immigration problems, right? There are always resentment that equality is not enough, right? The democracy is not enough. It is not enough universal. So it actually reveals the weakness of democracy because of your understanding of the patience that caused by the democracy, right? And the problem of this project of integration of regime and emotion is that actually, I think emotions, there are some very important emotions that are independent of regimes. And it is I think it's important to understand some independent source of the emotions for us to understand how can we change the regime to engineering some emotions we like, right? Because for your, according to your reform project, your proposal, actually I'm a little disappointed, right? Because you give us fascinating ideas of patience, but we actually don't see how can we use your idea of patience to change the regime. We want to know the sociology aspect of how can we change the patience for us to change the regime. I think it's the potential of your project to do that, but you actually didn't write on that topic much. And I think it might be possible for you to see that there are some independent sources of emotions, and that would be the possibility to try to change the regime through the emotions. For example, also related to the authoritarian regime, right? And the talk of various idea of equality. I think his idea of equality is about the general trend of modern society, right? It is not only about the democratic regime. It's the modern society in general is going to a trend of equality, more equal, more equal, and more equal, and including China. I think the population in China, they have a very strong sense of equality, but they translate equality into meritocracy and a kind of aristocracy, actually, right? So actually, either the democracy and the regime, they all use the emotions that generated by the modern society, the emotions associated with equality, either negative or positive, right? So I think so this kind of emotion, I think they are somehow independent from regime itself. It has its independent source from the modernity society processes, right? So I try to ask you about how you have thought about how we can try to engineer the emotions for us to change the regime, and that would be very helpful. Thank you.
I'd like to follow Professor Jiang's question. Very similar, but in fact, you speak of positive emotions and negative emotions, right emotions and wrong emotions, and you also speak of emotions can be enhanced or reduced. I wonder who is there to make all the distinctions, and who is there to manage, to contain, to discipline, or even to manipulate, as Professor Chen used the word, certain emotions. I mean, in your presentation, I got the impression that emotions are some kind of facts that over there, out there, and they are very important to play very important roles, and they accompany all our judgments on regimes. But on the other hand, you must admit that emotions are there to be managed and to be manipulated by the power that's be. I think that is a very crucial issue in today's international international politics. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was, no, I think I feel I need a bit more sort of a clarification about what kinds of emotion we're talking about, and especially how you rank them. It seems to me you have a kind of underlying strong moral assumption, a kind of moralized version of emotions. To me, emotions are pretty neutral. I mean, I can hate for good reasons or hate for bad reasons. I can hate a Nazi and I can hate a saint. It's always hate, but for wrong or good reasons. So, I mean, I was wondering how you sort of classify this kind of, following what also the moderator was suggesting. It seems to me you are falling back on a kind of moralistic approach, which is, I mean, okay, but I think it should be made explicit in order to understand better, I mean, your point of view. And then about I mean, this idea of populism and the instability of the Chinese regime. I mean, of course, I mean, this is it's a very tricky, difficult issue, and I think we are going to discuss this in 2 days. But I mean, we live in democracies in which majority of people don't trust anymore in democracy. They don't go to vote anymore. So I mean, what kind of stability gives? I mean, it seems to me this is a more unstable system than other systems. So in that sense, and then about well, okay, Chinese sort of attitude toward democracy at the international level. Something we will go back in these 2 days. I think. I mean, it's clear that on certain regards, some actions of the Chinese government are in line with sort of enlarging a bit the democratic nature, thinking about the recalibration of the weights within the international financial institutions. So despite the fact that domestically, of course, there is a problem in democratic terms, internationally, sometimes it might be even more advanced than other democratic countries, so we are here facing a paradox. And so we should make a distinction between what democracy is, national and international.
It's a lot of questions. I don't have one answer for all these questions. As I said, it's still a work in progress. Maybe I'll start with Raphael. The moralistic or my moralistic approach of emotions. It's possible. I don't know yet. But for sure, I am interested in the relationship between emotions and values. I said somewhere in my presentation that emotions are not simply feelings, and as such neutral feelings, they are also social markers. I said that they are, I think, socio-emotional actions and reactions. So I think it's, even though there is a physiological dimension of emotions, which can lead us to understand them as neutral, if you will, I think that there is also a strong connection between values and emotions. And I'm trying to look into this relationship. I don't have yet an answer. I hear what you are saying, but I think it's difficult to understand emotions in total disconnect from values. So I'm still exploring this relationship. First point. Second point, it is true that in fact, for many years I have been interested in the emotional dimension of social relations, including of international relations. That is to say that I have been interested in the psychology of international politics. I saw this at work when I was working for the UN as very, very important, but even before that, growing up in Europe, in the 70s and the 80s, one of the key issues for us, as young Europeans, how is it possible that Nazism came to be? So the question then was, how do we go about nurturing positive emotions, positive passions in the realm of politics, and how do we go about combating, containing negative emotions and negative passions of death and resentment, as these were the passions and emotions at the heart of Nazism, for instance. So for sure, what led me to be interested in this kind of issue is how do we contain negative emotions and passions? How do we nurture positive emotions and passions? And one of my answers, provisional answers to this question is the following. When we are at war within, and of course within is always shaped by how we relate to the outside, when we are at war within, we are at war with others. The fact that when Hitler was killing millions of people, he was still seeing himself as a victim is for me an indication of the fact that he was at war with himself. And so how do we understand war within as projecting war outside? So these are the things that I'm trying to think about. So it's possible that in all this there is a moral dimension, and it is true also that I tend to think that I always say that, for instance, in the end, intelligence is a moral faculty, and intelligence is a moral faculty as an emotional faculty. And I'm interested in the intelligence of the social, in social intelligence geared towards positive things and combating negative things. So I don't have an answer to these issues, but these are the things that I'm thinking about. The paradox between China at home and China internationally, you can still pursue democracy or democratic procedures and practices internationally in non-democratic fashion. It can be also geared by self-interest. So so more thinking on the matter. Professor Chen, the management of emotions, the engineering of emotion. Yeah, you are right. And that's why, in fact, I'm interested in these issues. What kind of institutions, what kind of social relations, what kind of relations of power can nurture positive emotions of respect of one another and so on, and combat negative emotions and passions. That's beyond the analytical dimension of the project, understanding the role of emotions in politics, national and international. I'm interested in trying to find the tools to engineer positively social relations and push them towards more positive practices and outcomes. So for sure, I have these two dimensions, this twofold approach: the analytical dimension and the practical, transformative approach. I'm thinking about these two things, and in things that I am publishing, I always talk about the value of clarity of the mind in analytical terms as a way to try to move forward a transformative project based on proper analysis. So I mean the two things are part of my thinking. Professor Chen, the weaknesses, of course, plenty of weaknesses. You say the democratic project never finished. You are right, and this is the strength and the weakness of the democratic project. But I still think also that there is the issue of threshold. I mean, democratic ideals and ideas do not have to turn into negative emotions and passions. They do not have to turn into resentment. And I think that, in a way you say this in your paper, there is the issue of threshold, of fulfillment of ideals, so that in fact people, although not fully satisfied, are satisfied enough not to turn resentful. So this is something to think about. The sociology of passion, that is to say, how do we engineer the right emotions? Yeah, I mean, clearly I'm thinking about these two things: the analytical dimension, and on the basis of the analytical dimension, provided that it brings about intellectual clarity, analytical clarity, try to think what would be the right way to go in terms of political path, in terms of the practice of political emotions and so on. Tocqueville, equality beyond democracy, Yeah, maybe, I don't know. It's possible that in the ancient regime he also thinks about the rise of equality prior to democracy. Maybe you're right, I don't know, I will have to look into the matter. Okay, and then Stefan, you are right. I mean, first of all, you see the populism is always used in a pejorative fashion. But I mean, populism is not always pejorative. The fact that people can be voting, for extreme parties, maybe they have good reasons to do so. I mean, we shouldn't be in the business of always disregarding. So populism, while always used in a pejorative fashion, is not necessarily a pejorative thing. So that's the first point. That's not fair to the people who are voting for it. So populism is not necessarily pejorative. You're right. I mean, there is a strong link between democracy and populism, and maybe this strong link is all the stronger when we lose the connection between democracy and republic. In a way, you see, when democracy stops being republican, in a way, democracy stops being democratic. So how do we preserve the republican dimension of democracy with the dynamics of rights and duties that it entails? I think that one of the tragedies of modern democracy is that it is losing this republican connection. In the process, it is losing this its democratic soul. In Western democratic thinking, in fact, the republican ideals are the guarantee of the ability of democracy to be democratic. And in fact, the fate of modern democracy today is to disconnect the two, and in the process to lose, to betray the soul of democracy, I tend to think. Because it's all about rights and not about the dynamics of rights and duties. It's all about entitlement and not about what is owed to others. It's me, and what about the others? Right? So, something to think about. Let's stop here. Okay. Yes?
I'm Jean-Marc Coicaud from Sechin Yeong-Shyang. I have a question about your methodology. Overall, I find your general thesis fascinating. I think it's an important argument that we need to think about democracy in the context of emotion, not only in the context of rationalism or reason, because it concerns about the motivation. How can we motivate democracy in the world there the disaffection of democracy is really, really problematic. So I think that overall, I must agree with your general idea, but in terms of method, I mean, you begin with this intimate relationship with a particular regime type and emotion. And mostly, I mean, since Plato and Aristotle and Montesquieu, I mean, the issue has been the matter of political psychology. How can we make sense of the relationship between the ruled and ruled, of the moral and political characteristics of regime? So the issue is generally about how to describe, how to understand the particular regime type. That's one. And second issue that you're getting into is more about normative theory, right? You're trying to represent, advance a new type of democracy in the global context, again, by fully taking advantage of the importance of emotion. I think that's perfect. And then Sharon Crow is actually trying to engage with this issue in the context of democratic deliberation, but still you're trying to move this whole thing in the global level. Right? Again, this is a normative question. The third question is about prescription. Like you engage with East Asia, China, right? Now, how can we conceive of a certain political regime in the context of your theory, your normative theory? So, what kind of role we can expect from China, whether China can probably, take this leadership, play this leadership role. This is a prescriptive or projective kind of issue. So here we're talking about emotions in the context of market theory, but then, here first you start with this descriptive issue. And second, you advance your normative question. And third, you're engaging with or struggling with your prescription question. But then, that because you don't provide us with a very clear overarching theoretical perspective or methodological perspective, people raise a lot of questions. I can agree with this emotion part, but then what about this China? There's kind of this disconnection between all these issues. So I'm just wondering, how can you convince us with your overarching kind of theoretical perspective?
Well, I don't have the answers. I think that when at least for myself, when I write, I don't write because I have the answers. I write because I'm looking for the answers. And as I told you, it's a work in progress. So part of the first book on global justice is written, and it's the easy part. It's about deconstructing international order as it functions now. So the deconstructive part is done. This is easy. The reconstructing part, which entails workable, which entails what I call the realist idealism, is in the pipeline, if you will. And this is difficult because on the one hand, you want to identify the right principles, but the right principle not simply in an ideal world, but in a world which is concrete, practical, so that in fact these principles move forward things and yet are still real enough to speak to the present and reality. So I'm still trying to put things together.
More questions? There, your first.
Let's talk again in 10 years. Just kidding.
I really appreciate your essay, and I would have one question, as in, why did you choose empathy as the primary value of democracy? Even though I agree, I just think it's interesting for you to elaborate, since I have the impression that empathy tends to be a leftist value, whereas maybe on the right people think about sovereignty and power and more in these terms. So I think it would be interesting for you to elaborate on this.
Why would empathy be a leftist value?
It seems to be that power and that kind of national interest is more, especially when you talk about, for example, immigration. Then you would have empathy with the immigrants, that would be more leftist. But it might be my misunderstanding, and I would ask you to clarify on that. Thank you.
Yeah. I didn't think about empathy as a leftist choice. It's more about the nature and dynamics of connectedness. What makes us connecting with others? What makes us feeling engaged in the fate of others? But that was my thinking.
Who are the others? That's the question.
That's a question, of course. Who is actually a right or the other? Who is an other who has a right, and what kind of rights? Of course, this is the key question. In fact, I sent to Professor Chen an article and chapter which is part of the deconstructive part of the book, which is already published, on what it takes for an actor to become a right holder at the international level via international law, and how does the defining of how and who becomes a right holder happens.
Thank you for Professor Chen to holding this opportunity and conference, and thanks for Jean-Marc to come to here as well. So I'm a PhD student from Rogers Stem program of Chien, and I have one question is, since democracy institutions are most vulnerable form of governance or regime to
most
vulnerable,
yeah,
to the that is most possible to be affected by the negative emotion as you described, like Donald Trump and current Paris first far right election congressman. And so how do you think that democracy core value can survive or prevent itself being invaded or contained by this kind of revised negative emotion to democracy? And do you think that will there be any difference between democracy country and democratization country on the practice of information? Like as we know that usually democratized country are more vulnerable to, are more easily to go to war than other democracy country. Thank you.
What is the second question?
So what would be the difference between democracy country and democratization country deal with the emotion effect, how emotion affect democracy and democratization country? Since the democratization country is more easy to go to war, as some empirical research suggests.
The countries in the process of
Yes, yes.
Oh, so
The new democracy country, maybe like...
New democracies go more to war than democracies?
Yes.
The first question, I mean, I don't think that democracies are necessarily very, very weak. I mean, we are also quite resilient. And one of the virtues of democracy, one of the elements of resilience, is the fact that we can overthrow a government without overthrowing the democratic regime, which is not an option in authoritarian regimes. You know, in authoritarian regime, you overthrow the government, and you very often overthrow the regime too. So I wouldn't really argue that democracies are very fragile. I think there is much resilience in democracy. That said, very often the worst enemies of democracies are non-democratic Democrats. And this is a key issue in the West, I mean, for a number of reasons. The second question, I mean, I'm not sure what would be the answer. Tim.
Hey, Jean-Marc.
Thank you for coming.
Mine is a methodological question. How do we approach emotions? Do we approach it just like one by one, empathy, compassion, hatred, blah, 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 and so on? Or do we need a deeper theory of so-called human nature, as particularly when we pay attention to more ancient theorists like St. Augustine? And because it all has to do with just how overall you view humanity, because you mentioned humanism too, and humanism might be a pretty reductive form of theory of human nature. And do you think that we need some kind of that, some type of theory of human nature?
I alluded to the connection between emotions and anthropology, and emotions and social anthropology. I think that, at work in emotions, you have a vision of the individual and of relations among individuals, for sure. And I don't think that we should approach emotion in a very discrete fashion, item by item. That's why you see I try to think about them via the categories of negative emotions and positive emotions, because clearly there are emotions which are constructive for oneself and constructive for others, and there are emotions which are destructive for oneself, destructive for others. And that's really what I'm interested in. How do we nurture a constructive environment, and how do we contain a negative environment? So I mean, your question to me is, I mean, do we need a theory of man, quote unquote, in its environment? I think that emotions are part of this theory. I mean, you don't have the theory and then the understanding of the emotions. I think that the understanding of the theory goes through emotions. That's why emotions are very, very important to understand, moral and political philosophy. And by overlooking them, I think we deprive ourselves from a key analytical tool and a key transformative tool. That would be my intuitive answer.
Any more questions, please? Oh, sorry.
You're hiding.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first one's follow up the discussion on emotions. I was wondering if you consider emotions as subjective, then perhaps we need a more deep understanding of how emotion works. So my further question is, do you think that emotion can be aggregated? For example, is there a moral difference between a discontent from a person or from a group of people? So, and my further question would be, if we regard the political regime as regimes of emotions, then does that imply the classification of this regime will be subjective and then fluid, namely depends on the emotions of people over time? So wouldn't that be a lack of a more objective standard to classify these regimes? And further question would be concerning emotions of whom. This regards with the boundary of democracy. As we know, democracy implies is responsible for its demos. So, for example, in international politics, would you say that a nation or a state can be held accountable for its actions by the emotions from other country citizens, or do we only care about emotions from its citizens? And also, in international level, as for example, in the tradition of realism, they consider state as the sole unique actor in the international level. And would you say that we should consider emotions of the state, or rather it's more individual? Thank you.
So the last question goes with the first question, aggregation. I think, of course, we can aggregate individual emotions into a collective. We do it all the time. So I think, yes, it's possible. Second question, are emotions subjective? It's not because an emotion is being experienced by a subject, but it makes it a subjective feeling. There are objective criteria for pain, for happiness. So once again, we tend to move, we tend to, based on the fact that emotions are experienced by a subject, we tend to conclude that it is subjective. This is a wrong conclusion. Something experienced by a subject shouldn't be by necessity understood and interpreted as subjective. So, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Just to follow up, I mean, maybe at least a step in your argument, but do you go as far as holding that democracy are emotionally superior to non-democracy? If it is so, I would resist to that. But
maybe
to
what?
clarify
Maybe what?
If this is so, I would resist to do this. I mean, I
No,
agree, but I want to know to what extent, because it seems to me you are building an argument and going in that direction. So I want
no, in
to
fact,
have it
because
clear.
you see, there are all kinds of pathologies associated with democracy. And in fact, I said in my presentation that I mean, some of the most horrific political phenomena of the modern era, I think cannot be understood. Nazism and fascism cannot be understood outside the modern democratic landscape. I would tend to argue. So is the emotional experience of democracy of a superior nature? Not necessarily, of course not. But if it is about agency and agency, I mean, I tend to argue that quote-unquote happy agency is non-egotistical agency, but this is agency which has come to terms with its limitations and so on. So, think about Rousseau. Rousseau has written in all kinds of fields. The social contract is on political connection among individuals. Emile is about fulfilling oneself through education. Eloise about love and fulfilling oneself through love. And I don't know how you call it in English, les rêveries du promeneur solitaire is about the relationship with nature. And so at the heart of all these very disparate kind of works, you have one question, which I think is the democratic question by excellence, which partly answers or addresses your question. What are the conditions under which, in a democratic setting, I am going to be open to myself, les professions? Am I going to be open to others, the social contract? Am I going to be open to the beloved, Eloise? Am I going to be open to my professor, Emile? Am I going to be open to environment, les promenades, in such a way that I'm not going to be swept away, but I'm going to be fulfilled in a non-egotistical fashion. I mean, this is one of the key questions, I think, of democratic agency and therefore democracy, a non-egotistical presence to oneself. And if one fulfills this, I think that one fulfills democratic ideals, democratic values, democratic emotions, and then perhaps yes, the emotional democratic experience enjoys a sense of superiority, maybe. But of course, there are all kinds of pathologies associated with the democratic experience. But there are, if we feel that democracy is a better regime than others, there are a number of reasons, including emotional reasons, for this to be so. So, what happened? I don't know. No, I mean, these are just ideas that I'm putting on the table. I don't.
We have a whole project.
Yeah, and of course, you see the pathologies are enormous when it comes to the emotional experience in democracy. But in the end, democracy is about trying to get rid of fear, right? And if fear is getting rid of, then there is a positive emotional experience associated with democracy. And believe me, I'm not really a democratic thinker. I'm interested in peace with oneself and peace with others. And what is the path for this? If democracy is the path, fine, but it doesn't have to be the path. I'm not a democratic thinker. Democracy is not my object of thinking. Maybe a mean, but it's not my object of your emotion. Well, I mean, for me, what is interested in is peace with oneself and peace with others. So how do we achieve this?
Yeah, a very small comment and a suggestion. A few years ago, I published a book called Chun-Hung that Professor Chen commented in this very room. And it opens on a chapter which is analyzing the geopolitics of values in the Taiwan Strait in 1683 and how values were mobilized between two regimes to achieve their agenda. And I've been thinking for a while about the geopolitics of values, and most of the questions I had to endure from the students or colleagues are pretty much the same as those which are asked to you on emotions. And it's very striking to see that thinking about the geopolitics of values and emotions are like sister thinking. Yeah. And a very simple way to solve several problems that have, or debates that have aroused, is to neutralize from the onset the notion of emotions. I mean by this that when we work on the geopolitics of values, people ask the same kind of questions. Do we do a hierarchy? How do we classify? How do we see something as positive or negative? Do we take sides? Do we have an ideology? People want to know that because it's very important. And on emotions, of course, it's a tricky issue. What is positive? What is negative? So from the onset, what you can say, and perhaps you've done it already in your writings, is to say that you have neutralized values, emotions. Neutralized meaning that you take any kind of values, no, any kind of emotion, sorry, as a, how to say, a way of expression or an item to be studied without putting your own values on it, and that you take it for granted, just, not granted, but just as a valid thing to observe, just as you rightly said that populism should not be, and I so agree with you, should not be viewed negatively, and you said all the time, I would say should never be seen negatively, just because if we do so, we switch from a position as a citizen who can have legitimate positions, including negative feelings about populism, and we will switch from a position of scholar who is studying this as a political phenomenon, which is valid per se, and neutralizing values is neutralizing emotions could be a very catching expression to show to people that you are not putting personal values in them.
Well, I like the idea of reflective and reflexive morality. Going back to your question, Raphael, of do you feel that the emotional democratic experience is of a superior nature? I mean, it is not if it is righteous, if it is not self and a lot of the democratic experience is very non-reflective. And I think that you see at the heart of the democratic project, there is the need, the imperative of being reflective, of being self-aware. And unless we have this, well, it's a joke.
But actually, I think one tradition, I mean, you didn't mention it, I don't know to what extent you rely on that, but of course, I mean, I don't know if you mentioned happiness in all of this, but it seems to me a significant sort of a bit of a gap. I mean, there is the entire utilitarian tradition looking at emotions and democracy, which is perhaps slightly different from yours, which might be seen as a way to neutralize emotions, I don't know,
yeah,
we can discuss in terms of utility and preferences. By the end of the day, I mean, you go there to some extent.
Yeah, but you know, the utilitarian approach is essentially about calculation. And in the process, I think that you miss, I mean, you end up in a world of instrumentalization. And I don't know if it is, of course, I mentioned happiness. I mean, you have this in the foundational documents of modern democracy, the US, and so on and so on. So happiness, but I mean, what kind of happiness? Once again, it is not meant to be egotistical happy. I think that there is, I mean, at least in the best field of democracy, the spiritual dimension to the emotional experience of democracy. But it's not one which has to do with egotism, with an egotistical approach to happiness. It's more like, a non-egotistical presence to oneself, others, and the world, and fellow citizens, and so on.
Okay, I think I must go stop here. We have a most wonderful and fertile session. And we will appreciate Professor Coicaud.
Yes, perfect.
Great speech. I think we have all benefited tremendously from this paper. Thank you very much.
Lunch break begins now.